Welcome back, everybody. I am doing a new video series called How I Made My First Comic. And in this specific video, we're going to talk about really the beginning, formulating the idea, the characters, how I created an outline for my characters, and really how that kind of worked into creating a script, creating the pages, the artwork. I am going to go through the entirety of making a comic from beginning to end. I will discuss the challenges. I will discuss, my thought processes, programs I used, influences, just really the whole gamut to, help those out there that are really curious about how this process works, and to really, maybe help people go out there and try to achieve the goal if they want to create their own comic book, and really educate people on how much work goes into creating a comic book. I know a lot of us fans, we go to a comic shop or we go to conventions and we just see an independent creator out there selling their comic book, or at a comic shop we see a wall of comics. And I think a lot of people don't realize just how much time and effort goes into creating a single issue. It can take months. It doesn't, we may see a monthly issue, but it can take way longer than an individual month to do that. Everybody has different processes. This is really just my process on how I do things. The ins and outs, all these little details that I try to think about, my influences, even going back to when I was a child, when I created my characters, and how that really morphed into the final comic book. This was the first issue of Icepick. I sold this at a convention for a few bucks, and it was black and white, as you can see. I did all the writing, all the story art, all the inking, all the coloring. And the very first book I sold was a 6-page preview of this book. And in doing so, I realized that there is definitely some fans out there that really like this. So for $1, I was selling a 6-page preview of that book. And once I had enough of it done, I was able to sell it, print it. I will talk about the printing process. I will go dollars and cents and really break down what it can cost for a comic book, at least what it costs for me. I know a lot of us will spend different amounts of money on comics, but it's achievable. And I want people to realize that you can achieve that dream if you want to make a comic book and print it. And that black and white issue turned into this issue, which is the actual comic book you can buy on my website. And I ended up, doing it all in color. It turned out really great. I can't say it's perfect. I can't say that it's one of those things that I think it could always be better. As an artist, we always feel that our artwork can be better, and this is, my throwback to 90s superhero comics, where that's where I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s, with starting out with reading G.I. Joe issues. And the image boom kind of happened, and I came across Todd McFarlane and Spider-Man, and then he ended up doing Spawn, and some of my favorite characters you can see behind me: Batman, Wolverine, and Spider-Man. And my sister made those for me, so shout out to my sister, who has always been one of those supporting people. And I have a wife that is super supportive, and over the last 20 plus years she has always been there, helping me achieve that dream and being that support system when I feel down, like I feel like I'm not accomplishing things, pushing me to do better. So I'm going to start out by really, talking about what I do, the programs I use, how I get things done, my workflow. Hopefully I'm not too boring, and hopefully this is information that you as a creator, or those that are already creating, maybe it gives you a little bit different perspective on how to still achieve the end result the same. So for me, I started out by working on a Mac. I am a Apple guy. Anyone that knows me, I've been a long kind of support of Mac computers. And so for me, the programs are going to be a little bit different. I know Word, Microsoft Word is a huge program people use. You can use text edit, you can use notes, you can use anything. I use Pages. It's Apple's software that's a like a word processing, very similar to Word. I just find it a little bit easier to work with. It's on the Mac platform. It comes with Mac, so there's no additional expense there. So already out of the gate, I buy my computer, which nowadays we all have phones, computers. They have a Word type of document that you can type out on, even if it's in Notes. And for me, it really helped to get me started because I was able to, I didn't have to have additional costs into buying software. And, that'll come down the road, like investing in software, but that's not necessarily something you have to do. There's a ton of software out there that's very inexpensive or cheap, and you can still achieve the same results. As a lot of professionals know, we're always hunting for the cheapest, the best software, the easiest workflow, a low kind of entry point of understanding the software. I mean, those are things that we're always on the lookout for. And so I started out in Pages. I basically was like, hey, how do I even write a script? How do you write an outline? I started with an outline. Okay, and before I even start the outline, I mean, I'm actually getting ahead of myself here. I had to create the characters. Now, I was lucky enough, growing up, I was kind of always a creative person. My mom says when I was like very young, I was drawing and doing stuff like that. For me, the earliest I can remember is right around teenage years, early teenage years. Uh, I would draw in actually elementary school and junior high. Kind of, I kept evolving and drawing more. And it's a cliche to say, to get better, you draw every day. That's 100% true. I can attest to that. The more you draw, the better you get, and that's with anything in life. I play guitar. The more I play guitar, the better I get at it. So if you're not an artist and you want to be an artist, start drawing. If you want to write and you're not a writer yet, start writing. So for me, that's where it started at a very early age, roughly, around 13ish, 12, 13. And I took that into junior high and into high school. And once I started reading comic books, I started, the creative juices just were flowing, and it was like, oh, this is really cool. And for me, it was all about escapism, and that's why I read comics even today. I love sitting down for whatever, 20, 30, 45 minutes to read a comic book or to read a graphic novel. And like people read novels and we watch films and TV shows. It's part of that escapism. And for me, as I started reading more comics, and Image Boom hit, and Spawn, and Batman, and things like that, and Punisher, Ninja Turtles, and Casey Jones. Like, these were some of the biggest influences on the character I created, Icepick. And I literally just started drawing out what I liked in comics. So you go back to some of the early Spawn issues. Shadowhawk was another pretty big influence as far as like how you capture a panel. And I'll get into that when I start talking about like taking a script and laying it out into panels and things of that nature, because it's a little bit different and everybody does it a little bit differently. But for this episode, I really want to just focus on like creation of your characters and your world, like the world building. And for me, it was, okay, I have a main character, Icepick. Okay, well, what is he? I had a name. I didn't really have a design. I didn't really have a backstory or secondary characters or villains or anything like that. So I really just started to focus on drawing a character that I thought looked cool. Some of those early renditions of Icepick were extremely rough. These were some of the early Shadowhawk influences of how, Jim Valentino ended up just laying out an action scene or laying out characters within the space of a panel. And so I just started drawing. I didn't do your typical character models, and I know a lot of people will do that. One of the artists I work with for Annabelle really did that, and that's what sold me on his ability to draw my characters. So I didn't do that. I literally just dove in and just thought like, okay, this is cool. And I loved kind of the anti-hero characters that were willing to go that extra mile to get the truth and justice and all those things. But there was a part of me that took a little bit from each of the characters, some of my favorite male characters, and I kind of put that all in a bowl and just kind of made my own cake out of all those ingredients. I like Batman. I liked him being in the shadows. I liked him being just kind of an anti-hero, but always kind of running from the cops and being that detective and that the smart side of it. Backlash was also another really big influence with Brett Booth's art. That probably was my biggest influence in a way, as far as the look of Icepick, and then also some of the characteristics of Backlash. I really enjoyed how he would dissipate into smoke. And so as I started formulating this, I had a name. I kind of had a loose idea of what I wanted the character to embody. And I loved Casey Jones. I grew up watching, the Ninja Turtle cartoon and then the live action movies, for better, for worse. It might be nostalgia for me, but those have always been super fun. Shut off your brain, have some popcorn, and just laugh and enjoy it, the lunacy of those films. But I really loved what how Casey Jones looked in the comic book and even also into the film. So I took that kind of hockey mask look and I made it my own, changed it up a bit, quite a bit. People still reference it to me. They say like, "Oh, dude, I really love the way you designed Icepick, and kind of looks like Casey Jones with the hockey mask." And I said, "Absolutely," but it's not. It doesn't look exactly like Casey Jones masks. That's the part of being a creative, is to take something familiar but then make it your own. So I kind of had a loose design for the mask, kind of had an idea what the character was. Well, now I had to really flesh out other characters. I mean, this could be a solo book, but when I'm 16, 15, 16, and I'm kind of throwing down on just regular old paper, lined paper at the beginning, and I'm trying to draw out this character and write this story, I'm looking at comic books that I had at the time, Shadowhawk, Backlash, Batmans and Spawns and things like that, Ninja Turtles. So I was looking at, like, I'm just gonna draw cool action scenes. Okay. And I love the revenge story. I love those kind of revenge tour films. I also, a big influence for me as far as writing goes is film and like TV shows, entertainment, that type of thing. And for me, really goes back to like John Carpenter's The Thing, where it's a very small cast. It tells a story in a couple days, a few days, and I knew that that's the formula I wanted. And so I had a character, I kind of had a formula, and then also I was like, I need secondary characters. So I kind of started thinking about, well, Spawn ended up being, killed, and he had a wife and a kid, and I'm like, oh, let me have the character of Icepick be engaged and him die, right? In a scientific accident, right? And that's, yeah, it's typical. It's one of those things. Again, it's something familiar, but then I changed it. Originally, I had Icepick being put in a meat locker, and he, got chemicals on him, and then they threw him in the meat locker, and the cops show up and they open the meat locker, and it's like an empty human form is gone from this giant block of ice, right? So that was the 16-year-old Todd, like, oh, that's super cool. Didn't really look great, and you can see here, it's just like, it's 16-year-old artwork for me. It's 15-year-old artwork, and I kind of took it from there and evolved, and I created Annabelle, and I didn't really create Luke until way, way much later, and we'll get into that. But originally, it was Icepick and Annabelle. He died. She didn't know that he actually lived. They kind of went through everything, and that's a story I do want to tell eventually, the kind of more origin story of Icepick. I hinted at it in the first 4 issues of Icepick. And so I had two main characters. Okay. And then, it's one of those things where I needed another character. I needed, more of, you had your strong hero, you had your female lead. Okay, what are, looking at films and TV shows and successful things, things that I liked, or maybe things that were commercially successful. How are the characters? And I really approached this in a very methodical way. And I would think about it. Okay, there's always comic relief in film, and I didn't really push to create my first comic book until after I was out of college. I was well into my 30s. And, after going to school and learning what's good design. You know, I have a degree in small business and design, so it really helps me understand some of the business side of creating a comic book, but also most importantly, in my opinion, is the design part. You know, you can kind of learn the business, this, you know, side of it as you go, but if you have, to me, as being an artist, like if you don't have really strong art, I think it's gonna be hard to really carry that. Bad art will only go so far. You know, bad storytelling is only going to get you so far. You really do need good storytelling and good art. And because I was more of an artist, I needed to hone in on my writing skills. So I looked up how to write comic scripts. I looked up, what does it take? What is it? Do you have an outline? How do you have an outline? What does it look like? On paper, what does it look like? So for me, it was really important to create a third character, and that third character is Luke, and he kind of became a little bit of the comedic relief. And that's important because when you have, if you're writing a story like a revenge filled story with bad guys and with a love interest, things can get very tense. Things can get very crazy, and they could always be at like an 11. I didn't want it to be at 11 all the time. And a good storyteller will tell you, you need these moments to break the ice, to bring things back down, and then you can go back, you know, crazy over the top stuff. But you need these moments where, whether it's just a couple moments of storytelling, you know, someone just doing something that's calming the whole story down a little bit. It gives the reader, the viewer, a moment to pause and to kind of gather themselves. And not all stories do that, and there's successful ones that don't do that. But I wanted to have that in my story. You know, I'm kind of a goofy guy. I'm sarcastic. I like to crack jokes. The wife and I have a ton of inside jokes, and so I have a good sense of humor. And I was like, well, I can add that humor into storytelling. You know, I didn't want a story that was serious all the time. I didn't want, you know, something that just never had real life moments, and life is ups and downs. So I had all my characters. I was like, okay, now I have three characters. How do I do this? I like revenge stories. I kind of figured, like, I really liked how, you know, Al Simmons died. I like Batman, Backlash, Spawn, all these different characters, Casey Jones. I had kind of a design down. Still never did character models. You know, that's one of the things that I just never did. So I was like, all right, let me start this out. And how do I build an engaging story? A lot of people will say there's like a three-tier basis for good storytelling, you know, beginning, middle, and end. I thought, okay, maybe I can tap into that a little bit. But, you know, for me, this was, you know, after my wife and I moved out to like Seattle, Washington area, and I really, you know, fell in love with this city. So I was like, okay, let me do Seattle. Let me just kind of loosely base it off of, you know, Pacific Northwest. And there's a lot of cool things out here. There's a lot of places to get lost. People go hiking every year and end up not being prepared and getting lost on trails. So, you know, I felt like this is a good area where you could have a wide variety of stories. And variety is also another important key for me. Is I wanted variety in characters, not just, you know, male, female, different races or different things, you know, lifestyles. I wanted variety in who they are, where they came from. You know, Icepick is a little bit more serious, still chilled and can crack a joke, but then, you know, Annabelle is more or less like, again, still a little bit more serious. She's more like the foundation and level-headed kind of person. And Luke is not always serious. He's kind of the goofy guy. He finds himself in trouble all the time. And those three characters they're all different, and that's important. And I want to introduce even more characters and more variety of things, and that's later down the road with other issues. You know, so for me, I had my characters, I had my influences, I had a rough story idea. And then the first thing that I really felt is important is to, for me personally, was to create an outline. So as you see here, this is my outline for the first 4 issues of Icepick. And, you know, we'll dive in a little bit and talk about this and how that came to be. So for me, it was each story I wanted to, you know, I had a main story. Icepick gets killed. His fiance doesn't know he's dead. Luke helps him kind of figure out, like, as he realizes, Icepick realizes he's alive and he has these newfound powers. Okay, so he's kind of like a superhero, and he's like, wait a minute, the backstory becomes Icepick's parents were murdered. Those same people tried to kill Icepick and they failed. So then he goes on this revenge tour. He's like, hey, I want to get the people that killed my parents, get the people that tried to kill me. I mean, as simple as that. Comics don't have to be complicated. They don't have to be crazy, detail. Like a lot of it is, for me, it's like how you tell a good story. A good story could be 5 minutes. A good story could be 3.5 hours, like some of the Lord of the Rings stuff. You know what I mean? Like it just doesn't matter. A good story is a good story. It doesn't matter how the length of it. So I kind of had my three main characters. I had my story idea. Well, now I need a villain, right? So how do I come up with a good villain? This kind of goes into chapter one, chapter two. I did my 4 issues and I was like, okay, each issue is gonna have its own story to it, that all 4 issues together give you the complete story. I'm a huge fan of like miniseries, so I thought this was a good way for me to kind of introduce people to Icepick. And this is really my story notes as I'm thinking about this story. It's 3 paragraphs. It's probably too long, to be honest. And I could even say, my chapter summaries are probably too long. And the important thing about, for me to do a story summary, is for me as the writer to stay on track for that issue. I don't want to tell too much. I don't want to tell not enough. I kind of want to keep it open enough to keep the reader engaged and involved. I love action scenes. I love moments of storytelling. So I wanted to make sure that each issue had those elements, a little, a bunch of action, some storytelling. It could be both at the same time. And, when I go back to creating a good villain, I mean, so many things make a good villain. I mean, there's so many good villains out there. Joker's a good villain for me. He, unfortunately, like Batman never kills him, and that's Batman's thing, right? But, Icepick wasn't like that. Icepick was more or less the anti-hero vigilante in a way, more like the Punisher. And that's what I took from the Punisher is, he was willing to go that extra step for justice, to get bad people off the street. And he doesn't necessarily think twice about it because someone tried to kill him. So in his mind, it kind of broke a little bit, and he's like, I'm not going to sit here and wait for the justice system to do this. I'm going to handle it myself. And that's where he kind of is a little bit of a hothead. But for me, the greatest or the best villain would be Satan, and I grew up in the church for years. I spent time, reading the Bible and learning about all this. And, I've gotten away from that as I got older. I would say that Lucifer and Satan were always the opposing force of the ultimate good and the ultimate evil, right? You always had this balance of good and evil. And that's another thing I took from Spawn, listening to Tom McFarlane in interviews, like it was very similar. Like that's been done a million times, and it's going to be done a million more times, as far as like the battle of good and evil and what's the ultimate evil. Depending on what you believe, it could be totally two different things. But for me, the ultimate good and evil was God and Satan. So I took Satan. I did some research on this, and I obviously, a lot of people know Dante's Inferno. That was a huge influence. So I read that and I was like, oh, I started diving a little bit deeper in the characters. And so I love the whole Satan demon aspect. And early on, even in early Icepick stuff, I had a demon as the villain. And I'm like, okay, let me keep going with this demon theme, but I need to flesh this out. I need to give this demon reasons. I need to give him, some, and people do, demons all kind of different ways. Like some of them are mindless, some of them just follow orders. I wanted mine to have a purpose. And I thought it would be a little bit more interesting to give the bad guy like a solid purpose onto why he killed Icepick's parents, why he tried to kill Icepick. And after reading Dante's Inferno, you have these, the 9 circles of hell. Well, 9th circle of hell was Mordred. So for those that don't know Mordred, he was the son of King Arthur, and I'm a huge fan of King Arthur. And 1981 Excalibur is probably the best King Arthur story in my opinion. But Mordred was, King Arthur's son, and he betrayed him, right? So the ninth circle of hell, based on Dante's Inferno, was for the ultimate betrayers. And so I was like, okay, that's something I can work with. And so then I started fleshing out this character about who is Mordred, what's his motivations, and it come to find out that, hey, we learn in the story, by the time I get to issue 4, we learn why Mordred was going after Icepick. For me, I love the shoe drop element of, you're kind of like, hey, what's going on? You're not really sure as a reader, but then they drop that shoe and you're like, oh wow. And I wanted that for the readers of Icepick. I wanted issue 1 to introduce him, to show his his character, right, who he is, what he's willing to do. He kills people in the first issue. I wanted to introduce all the characters, right? I wanted to introduce Annabelle and Luke and Icepick. And I don't introduce Mordred. I actually introduce what ends up becoming kind of a secondary villain. At first, you're kind of like, he's the main villain, and that's a character called Freak, and that character is almost like Mordred's puppet. And I explain all that in the 4 issues. So I introduce Freak as what people think as the main villain, and I thought that would be a fun little twist to introduce a villain, and then by the end of the 4 issues, you realize he's really not the main villain. I introduce like henchmen and guys that are just sent to go kill Icepick and kill those, capture, kidnap his loved ones and set a trap. There's always traps in movies and shows, and I thought that would be fun. So by the end of the 3rd, 4th issue, you realize why Mordred wants to kill Icepick. You realize, and these are the shoe drops in my story, you realize why Freak is who he is, and you realize why he's going after Icepick. For those that haven't read Icepick, I don't want to spoil too much. I mean, it's been out for a few years now. I get it, but I think there's still potential for a lot of new readers. So I don't want to spoil too much, but I will say that you read these things, and I reveal who Freak is and why is he connected to Icepick. And then I reveal later in Annabelle, I continue these stories. So, for this episode, we're really just focusing on taking an idea, a character, the influences of what we have around us. I mean, I talk about movies and comic books. That still is a big part of my life. But it could be family members. It could be a person on the street. It could be a life experience. And I've talked with creative people, indie comic book creators. Our influences are everywhere. I mean, they are in every little thing that we see and do and interact with, and the experiences we have. And you can take that and make it into a fun story, or a serious story, a horror story. You can do all of that. It just takes a little bit of research, a little bit of time. And from this outline, I will say I went in and started actually writing a script. And that script is really the basis of how I go about drawing everything. And this is what I give to artists that I work with as well. So this does take some time. Back in the day, I did kind of hand type all this out. I'm terrible at spelling, so spell check's a big part. It helps me quite a bit. Now I use dictation on my Mac, which makes it even a little bit faster. We're always trying to find like the quickest way to do things. I don't use AI. I'm one of those people that stays away from that as best I can. If I'm explaining something, like this whole paragraph here, like this is a lot. So, I can just talk this out faster than I can type. I'm not the fastest typer either. You can take a look at this script and you can see how it's broken down and how I write a script. Looking at this script, I do, because I am such a fan of film and TV, just film in general, whether it's short films, independent films, TV shows, things like that. I will use a lot of film setup scenes, like exterior view of a city. I also, I kind of put it based on Seattle skyline, but no defining buildings. But for me, it was important to kind of make it a little bit like the city, but not obvious enough. For me, if you look at the script, you'll see like TV for Thought Balloon. And this is just kind of a voiceover thought balloon where Icepick is talking, saying that this is his city, this is my story type of thing. It sets up my entire universe. Like this here is my entire universe. It says, this city, we already established that it's a city. We established that this is the city he lives in. We established this is his story. And like so many other stories, it's filled with mystery, death, and most important of all, love. I think that's important to really establish for good storytelling. I think it's important to establish these things out of the gate. And then I just go into each page. Okay, I love splash pages. So there's a specific thing when you're writing a comic book, you know, you have to worry about page cadence. If you're going to do a splash page, it can be really cool, it can be really exciting, but you need to make sure that it's always on an even number page. It starts on an even number, ends on an odd number. And I like to give as much information per panel if need be. So, you know, we could do like a long wide angle of a cityscape. It's nighttime. There's many different ways to write a script. I can't, you know, say that enough, that Marvel scripts are completely different. I've spent some time researching how comic book scripts look. Okay, I like to, you know, highlight what page, the page number. Okay, I do everything in all caps for when I'm writing. Typically, you would probably make all, you know, what people are saying not in all caps. It'd be easier for the letterer. And we'll get into that once I start talking about the lettering side of things. I don't do that because I letter my books myself, but if I were, I would probably change this for a letterer. You know, at the end of the day, I want as much detail for the artist to really get my vision out there. So this is what a script looks like. You do panel 1, panel 2, panel 3, however many panels it takes to tell the story for that page. You know, I don't like dialogue heavy comics, even though it looks like there's maybe a lot of dialogue here. I think this is probably the most dialogue in one person speaks in this issue. But for me, I don't like to add in a lot of fodder for my dialogue. I like it to be clear, concise, and to the point, and to stay on point. So it's important to do that. You know, you can kind of format this really whichever way you like. This is just the way I format it. Each script, this was the very first script I did, so it's not the same format that I use now. It still gets the point across. And that's the point of this episode, is hopefully it gave you some insight into how I make a comic, how I start. This is the beginning. This is the first episode. There will be multiple episodes. You can follow along. I will put all that in the description, and I'll link to the next video once that's out, to this one, and you'll just be able to kind of go back and forth and watch all these episodes. So I hope that this has given you some sort of insight. I hope it's, you know, maybe motivated you in a way to start writing. You know, good stories. We always need good stories. For me, I really enjoy telling stories. Icepick also really launched all the other stories for Dark Space Studio. It launched Annabelle, and I was able to take that and really follow what I established in Icepick and expand on it. I expanded her story. I talked about where she came from, who she was, who her parents were, you know, how are they connected to Icepick's parents? How are they connected to Luke's parents? And then, you know, with what's going on with Luke right now, it's the same thing. I'm expanding his story. What's his background? Where did he kind of come from? How is he connected to all the other characters? And, you know, after Luke, we'll be going back to only Icepick stories with everybody involved. Now that we've really gotten everything out of the way, we can just tell good, fun stories, exciting stories. Hopefully they're entertaining, serious or not. I love the supernatural characters. One of the reasons why I really, you know, work with demons and kind of Satan in the beginning is I love the supernatural characters. In Annabelle, there's a dragon. Luke, there's vampires and fairies. So we really do have the gamut, you know, supernatural characters, and I even have more showing up in further issues. So thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this, and you know, I wasn't too boring about my process and how I do things, and hopefully it gave you quite a bit of insight on, you know, how you can go out there and create a comic, or just in general what goes into making a script. So this was how I made my first comic, episode 1. Stay tuned for more, and I will see you in the next video.